The wire transfer confirmation arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, and by Friday my wife had suggested we look at houses in a neighborhood we had never once discussed in 3 years of marriage. I remember the exact sequence because I've gone back over it so many times that it has acquired the precision of something studied rather than lived. Tuesday, the notification from my late father's estate attorney, a man named Gerald Hutchins who wore the same gray suit to every meeting and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who understood that money, delivered incorrectly, could detonate families. The transfer of $4 million into the joint account my father had established specifically for this purpose, to be released upon the 3-year anniversary of his death, per the terms of a will he had written with the specific care of a man who did not entirely trust the people his children might choose to love. Wednesday, I told Vanessa. Thursday, she was quiet in a way I mistook for processing. Friday, she had found a real estate listing for a house in Maplewood Estates, a gated community 40 minutes outside the city where the minimum property value sat comfortably above $2 million, and she slid her phone across the breakfast table and said, "What do you think?" I looked at the listing. 4 bedrooms, a pool, a kitchen that had been photographed with the specific artistry reserved for things being sold rather than used. I said, "We've never talked about moving." She said, "We've never had $4 million before." She smiled when she said it. The smile was warm and immediate, the smile I had fallen in love with 4 years ago at a fundraising dinner for a hospital expansion project, where she had been volunteering at the registration desk and had handed me my name tag with a look that suggested she found the entire event slightly absurd and was glad I appeared to as well. I smiled back. I said we could look. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a stupid man. My name is Richard. I am 41 years old and I run a mid-sized civil engineering consultancy that I built from 3 employees to 47 over the course of 12 years through a combination of technical competence and the kind of sustained attention to detail that my father, who was an accountant, always said was the only reliable form of intelligence. I understand numbers. I understand contracts. I understand the gap between what something appears to be and what it structurally is. I did not apply any of this to Vanessa. She was 33 when we met, 34 when we married. She was beautiful in the way that photographs don't quite capture, something about the quality of her attention, the way she held a room without appearing to try. She had a degree in art history and worked for a small gallery downtown, which she described as something she did because she loved it rather than because it paid, which was accurate on both counts. She was funny in the dry, understated way that I've always found more attractive than performance. She was warm with my friends. She was patient with my occasional absorption in work problems that had no place at a dinner table. She was, I genuinely believed, the person I had been waiting to find without knowing I was looking. We were married 14 months after we met. My father died 8 months after that, a cardiac event, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare or say the things you should have said years earlier. In the grief that followed, Vanessa was exactly what a spouse is supposed to be. Present. Steady. She managed the things I couldn't manage. She sat with me through the nights when the loss was too large for sleep. She held me together at the funeral with the quiet competence of someone who understood that grief had a practical dimension as well as an emotional one. It was only later, much later, after the Tuesday wire transfer and the Friday real estate listing and the series of small revelations that followed, that I would understand she had also, at some point in those early months of our marriage, learned the exact terms of my father's will. And that the knowledge had changed something in the calculation she was running. The house in Maplewood Estates was the first visible crack. The thing that didn't fit. Not because wanting a beautiful house was wrong, I understood that impulse, had felt versions of it myself. But because of the timing. Because of the specificity. Because of the way the suggestion arrived not as a dream tentatively offered but as a considered proposal, complete with a listing already identified, in a neighborhood she had clearly been researching before I had processed what the money actually meant. She knew the price range. She knew the area. She knew exactly what $4 million could buy. And the question that began forming in me that Friday morning, quietly, in the way structural questions form, before they become urgent, was, how long has she known? The house in Maplewood Estates did not happen. I said I wanted time to think about what to do with the inheritance responsibly, which was true and also bought me space I didn't yet know I needed. Vanessa accepted this with a grace that I appreciated and later re-examined. Our life, in the weeks after the transfer, took on a slightly different texture. Not dramatically different, nothing that would have registered to anyone watching from outside. But I was paying a new quality of attention, the kind that activates once a question has been asked and cannot be unasked, and under that attention certain things became visible that the previous quality of looking had missed. Vanessa had always been interested in our finances in the way that a partner reasonably is, aware of our joint account, conscious of major expenditures, involved in the broad decisions about saving and spending that a shared life requires. I had not thought this unusual. It is, in fact, exactly what financial transparency in a marriage looks like. What I noticed now was a different order of interest. She began mentioning investments. She forwarded me articles about property markets and portfolio diversification with a frequency and specificity that felt like research rather than casual reading. She had a conversation with me about whether we should engage a financial advisor, a reasonable suggestion, genuinely reasonable, except that she had already identified 3 specific firms and had opinions about their fee structures that suggested prior investigation. I said yes to the financial advisor. I chose one of the 3 she'd identified, a man named Patrick who turned out to be excellent. But I filed the preparedness away. I also began, in a way I'm not entirely proud of but can't entirely regret, paying attention to her phone. Not through it. I never accessed her messages or her accounts. But the periphery of her phone life had a texture that I could observe without intrusion. The frequency with which she stepped away to take calls. The specific shift in her posture when certain messages arrived, a straightening, a focusing, the body language of someone receiving information rather than casual communication. There was a name that appeared on her screen more than others. I saw it twice in the periphery of her notifications, a contact she named simply Kara. I knew a Kara tangentially, Vanessa's college friend, someone she mentioned periodically over the years, someone I had never met because Kara lived on the West Coast and their friendship was maintained largely through calls and occasional visits. I knew this because Vanessa had told me. What I didn't know, what I had no framework for knowing yet, was whether what she told me about Kara was complete. The second sign came from my friend David. David and I had been close since university, the kind of friendship that survives geographical distance and different life trajectories and long gaps between contact, and resumes exactly where it left off every time. He was a lawyer, corporate, the kind who understood both the mechanics of money and the ways people behaved around it. He'd been at our wedding. He'd liked Vanessa, or had appeared to. We had lunch in November, about 6 weeks after the inheritance transfer. We talked about work, about his upcoming marriage, about the city. And then, toward the end of the meal, he said something that arrived with the casualness of a comment and the weight of something considered. He said, "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me to mind my own business." I told him to ask. He said, "When did Vanessa first find out about your father's will? The specific terms." I looked at him. "I asked," he said, "because I was at a dinner about a year before your father died. A charity thing. Vanessa was there. And I heard her in a conversation with someone, I didn't catch who, and she was talking about estate structures. The specific kind your father used. Discretionary trusts, release timelines. The exact language?" He paused. I assumed at the time she was just making conversation. But I've been thinking about it since October. I drove home from that lunch and sat in the car outside our building for 20 minutes. My father had died 8 months into our marriage. The will's terms, the $4 million, the 3-year release, were not public knowledge. They were not the kind of thing I had advertised. I had told Vanessa about the inheritance in broad terms early in our relationship, the way you disclose significant financial context to someone you're serious about. I had told her about the 3-year condition sometime in the first year of marriage, after my father died, when the estate began to be administered. But the specific terms, discretionary trust structures, release timelines, those were not things I had explained in that kind of technical detail. Someone had. The question was who, and when, and why Vanessa had been discussing them before my father was even gone. I did not confront Vanessa that week, or the week after. I did what I do when a structural problem presents itself. I gathered information methodically, without alerting the structure to the investigation, because a structure under investigation that knows it is being investigated behaves differently than one that doesn't. This is not a principle I invented. It is simply what's true of complex systems under stress. I called Gerald Hutchins, my father's estate attorney. I said I had some questions about the estate administration timeline and whether any inquiries had been made by third parties about the will's terms during my father's lifetime. I framed it as a general question about confidentiality. Gerald was a careful man, as I mentioned. He chose his words the way architects choose load-bearing elements, with precision and awareness of consequence. He said, "Estate documents are confidential. We don't discuss terms with anyone outside the named parties and their legal representatives." I said, "What about before a person dies? If someone were trying to find out the terms of a will before probate?" A pause. Then, "There are ways determined people find information that don't go through official channels, particularly if they have access to someone in a position to know." I thanked him and hung up. Someone in a position to know. My father had two people in his immediate circle who understood the will's terms, Gerald himself, and his longtime personal accountant, a man named Morris, who had been managing my father's finances for 20 years and who, I now recalled, had a nephew who worked in the same building as the gallery where Vanessa was employed. I am not going to pretend that the chain I constructed from these facts was definitely true. It was a hypothesis. But it was a hypothesis that fit the available data in the way that hypotheses, when they're correct, tend to do, not by explaining some of the evidence but by explaining all of it, including the pieces that had seemed unrelated. The timeline, assembled carefully, looked like this. Vanessa and I met at a fundraising event for a hospital expansion. The hospital's largest donor that year was my father, a fact that was publicly documented in the event program, which also listed my father's name next to a donation figure that made the scale of his wealth unambiguous. My name was listed as his son. We met. We dated. We fell in love, or I fell in love, which is the part one was no longer certain about on her side. Somewhere in the first year of our relationship, before or around the time my father died, Vanessa had been in a conversation about discretionary trust structures and estate release timelines. She had been researching not merely that my father had money but the specific mechanism by which it would reach me and when. We married 14 months after meeting. My father died 8 months into the marriage. The will was administered. The 3-year clock began. 3 years and 1 week after my father's death, the wire transfer. 3 days after the wire transfer, the Maplewood Estates listing appeared on her phone. The pieces did not prove intent, but they described a shape. And the shape was not the shape of a woman who had fallen in love with a man. It was the shape of a woman who had identified a target, established a timeline, and managed a relationship with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the prize required a particular duration of investment. I sat with this for 2 weeks before I told anyone. The person I told was David. He listened. He asked questions, the specific, sequenced questions of someone used to building cases from evidence. At the end of it he said, "Before you do anything, I want you to speak to someone I know. A family lawyer. Not to file anything. Just to understand what your position looks like from the outside." Her name was Angela. She was 52, direct, and had the specific manner of a person who had heard every possible version of this conversation and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon and told her what I knew and what I suspected. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "The first thing I want to know is whether there is a prenuptial agreement." There wasn't. My father had suggested it, gently, before the wedding. I had declined. I had been in love, and the suggestion had felt like a failure of faith in something I believed in completely. Angela wrote something on her notepad. "The second thing I want to know," she said, "is whether the $4 million is in a joint account." It was. I had added Vanessa to the estate account when it was established, 3 years ago, because she was my wife and because the gesture had felt like the right expression of partnership. Angela set her pen down. "Richard," she said, "before we discuss anything else, I need to advise you to speak to a financial advisor about separating that account. Today, if possible. Not as a declaration of intent. As a protective measure while you establish the facts." I called Patrick on my way out of Angela's office. The account was separated by end of business that day. The friend named Kara turned out to be the center of everything. It took me another 3 weeks to find her, not because she was hidden, but because I had been looking in the wrong direction. I'd assumed Kara was who Vanessa said she was, a college friend, West Coast peripheral. What she actually was, I discovered through the kind of patient digital reconstruction that feels slightly shameful and entirely necessary, was Vanessa's oldest friend, her closest confidant, and the person who had introduced her to Morris's nephew, the accountant's nephew who worked in the same building as the gallery. Her full name was Kara Whitfield. She had a professional profile on a business networking site that listed her occupation as private wealth consultant, a title that existed in a nebulous space between financial advisory and something less easily categorized. She specialized, according to her profile, in high net worth individual asset management and estate planning. I read that description 3 times. I thought about Vanessa at a charity dinner, discussing discretionary trust structures with someone she hadn't identified. I called David. He said very quietly, "Richard." I said, "I know what Kara Whitfield appeared to be, and I want to be precise about the word appeared, because I was constructing a case from inference and pattern rather than direct evidence, was someone who understood inherited wealth with professional specificity. Someone who knew how estates worked and how to identify, with accuracy, the circumstances under which significant money would transfer and to whom." I thought about how Vanessa and I had met. The fundraising dinner. The hospital expansion. My father's name on the donor list next to a figure that made his net worth legible to anyone who knew how to read it. I thought about whether it was possible that the meeting had not been accidental. This is the thought I had been circling for weeks without landing on directly. It was too large, in some ways, too cinematic, too conspiratorial, too much like the plot of a film rather than the life of a man who built bridges and ran a consultancy and had simply, he thought, been lucky enough to meet someone extraordinary at a dinner. But the data kept pointing at it. I hired an investigator. I want to be honest about this because it is not something I am comfortable with, and it is also something I believe was correct. A woman named Sandra who had been recommended to me through Angela's network, who operated with the specific discretion of someone who understood that the information she gathered would be used in legal contexts. I told her what I was looking for, any documented connection between Vanessa, Kara Whitfield, and the charity dinner where we had met, prior to the date of the dinner. Sandra came back to me in 10 days. What she found was not the smoking document I had half hoped for and half dreaded. It was something more ambiguous and more devastating in its way. A social media post from 4 years ago, before the dinner, before Vanessa and I met, in which Kara Whitfield had tagged Vanessa in a comment on a photo from a previous year's iteration of the same annual hospital fundraiser. The comment read, "Same time next year?" Vanessa had attended the same fundraiser the year before we met. My father had been listed as a donor that year too. The post had since been deleted. Sandra had found it in an archive. I sat in my office with this information and felt something I can only describe as the completion of a calculation I had been running for months. Not shock, I had moved past shock weeks earlier. Not grief, not yet. Something colder and more structural. The final confirmation that the load-bearing element I had trusted most had been, from the beginning, something other than what it appeared. I called Angela. Then I went home to my wife and made dinner and ate across from her and listened to her talk about a painting that had come into the gallery that week, something she was excited about, genuinely excited, and I watched her face and thought about the woman I had believed I was eating with, and the woman I now understood I was actually eating with, and the distance between those two women. Which was the distance between the life I'd thought I was building and the one I had actually been inside. The dinner was good. We talked easily. She laughed at something I said. I looked at her and thought, how much of this was ever real? It was the question I couldn't answer. It is the question I still can't answer fully. And it is, I've come to understand, the question that does the most damage. Not the betrayal itself, the uncertainty about what was genuine inside it, whether any moment was what it felt like, whether the laugh across the table was hers or a performance, whether the grief she'd helped me through after my father died was love or investment. That uncertainty is its own specific wound. I chose a Saturday morning. Sam, we had no children, which I was grateful for in this specific context, was not a factor. It was just us, the apartment, the morning light coming through the windows of the place we'd shared for 3 years, and the conversation I'd been building toward for 2 months. I had not told Vanessa about any of it. Not the conversation with David, not the meeting with Angela, not Sandra's investigation, not the separation of the account. I had maintained the surface of our marriage with the discipline of someone who understood that premature disclosure would give her time to prepare a response rather than a truth. She was making coffee when I came into the kitchen. She was in the gray sweater she wore on weekend mornings, her hair loose, the radio on low. An ordinary Saturday. The kind that accumulates into a life. I sat at the kitchen table. I said, I need to talk to you about something. And I need you to understand before I start that I have been thinking about this for a long time and I have spoken to people who have helped me understand the shape of it. So this isn't a conversation where denial helps either of us. She turned from the counter. Her face moved through several expressions quickly, surprise, then a particular settling, the way a person looks when something they have been anticipating for an uncertain period has finally announced itself. She sat down. I put Sandra's document on the table. The archived post. Kara tagged, Vanessa tagged, the year before we met, the same fundraiser. She looked at it. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, where did you get this? It doesn't matter where, I said. What matters is that you were at the same event the year before we met. The year my father was listed as a lead donor. And that your closest friend is a private wealth consultant who specializes in high net worth estate planning. Vanessa looked at the table. I need to understand, I said, whether what happened between us was what I believed it was, or whether it was something else from the beginning. What followed was not a rapid confession. It was not a dramatic breakdown. It was something slower and more complicated, which is to say it was the truth, or a version of it, arriving in stages the way truth does when a person has had years to construct the narrative they prefer and is now watching it become inadequate. She said that yes, Kara had pointed out the fundraiser, had mentioned my father's name, my father's estate, the fact that his son, me, would be attending. That Kara had framed it as an introduction to someone interesting, which was the phrase Vanessa used. She said that she had gone to the dinner knowing who I was in a financial sense before she knew who I was in any other sense. She said, and this is the part I've sat with longest, that what she had expected and what had actually happened were not the same thing. I expected to meet someone I could manage, she said, the word landing between us with the specific ugliness of something honest. Someone straightforward. And then I met you. I looked at her. I'm not telling you that makes it right, she said. I know it doesn't. I'm telling you what happened. That it became real. That the last 3 years were not, that I was not performing all of it. But some of it, I said. A silence. The beginning, she said. The beginning was a calculation. When did it stop being a calculation? She looked at the window. The morning light was doing the thing it did on autumn Saturdays, golden and specific, the kind of light that makes everything look like it belongs in a photograph. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. I don't know when it changed. I know that it did. But I can't give you a date. I nodded slowly. And the house? I said. Maplewood Estates. 3 days after the transfer. She closed her eyes. Old habit, she said quietly. I knew the money was coming. I'd known for 3 years. And when it arrived, the reflex was still there. Even when other things had changed. So the reflex was always there, I said. Underneath whatever else changed. She didn't answer. The silence answered. I stood up. I walked to the window. The city outside was doing what cities do on Saturday mornings, unhurried, ordinary, entirely unaware. I've spoken to a lawyer, I said. I've separated the estate account. I'm not making any decisions about what happens next from a position of financial vulnerability. She absorbed this without visible reaction, which told me she had anticipated it, which told me something about the version of herself that had never fully disappeared. What do you want? She said. I want to understand something first, I said. The grief. After my father died. Was any of that real? The question sat in the room. When she answered, her voice was different, lower, stripped of the quality of management that had been present throughout. Yes, she said. That was real. I want you to know that. Whatever else was calculation, that wasn't. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, I believe you. And it doesn't change anything. The divorce took 11 months. Angela was excellent, precise, fair, and possessed of the specific quality of a lawyer who understands that the goal is resolution rather than warfare, while also understanding that resolution requires the other party to operate in the same register. Vanessa engaged her own lawyer, a man named Foster who was more aggressive than the situation required and who cost her more in legal fees than the additional ground he gained was worth, which was a kind of poetic mathematics I tried not to take satisfaction in. The settlement was what it was. Without a prenuptial agreement, Vanessa had a legal claim on marital assets accumulated during our 3 years of marriage. The $4 million in the estate account was specifically structured in a way that Angela argued, successfully, placed it outside the category of marital property, being an inheritance received and maintained in a dedicated estate account rather than commingled with joint finances. The separation I'd made the day I left Angela's office for the first time turned out to be the most consequential 2 hours of the entire process. What Vanessa received was a portion of the equity in the apartment, and a settlement figure that reflected 3 years of shared financial life. It was not nothing. It was also not $4 million. Foster had pushed for more and Angela had held the line with the patient precision of someone who had done this many times and understood exactly where the floor was. I sold the apartment. I did not want to live in the rooms where the particular Saturday morning had happened, or any of the ordinary evenings that preceded it, or the grief-drenched weeks after my father's death when I had believed completely in the person sitting across from me. I bought a smaller place. Not a statement of diminishment, a deliberate choice towards simplicity. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, windows that faced east so the morning came in early and clear. I furnished it slowly, with things I chose because I wanted them rather than because they completed a picture someone else was framing. David helped me move. He and his fiancée came on a Saturday with a hire van and a tolerance for flat-pack furniture that I was genuinely grateful for. We assembled things and ate pizza on the floor of the new living room, and he did not ask me how I was feeling because he understood that the question was too large for a Saturday and that presence was more useful than inquiry. My therapist, a man named Robert who I had started seeing midway through the legal process, asked me, in one of our early sessions, what I was most angry about. I thought about it for a while. I said, not the money? I know that sounds wrong, but it's true. The money is replaceable. I can build it back. It will take time, but I know how to work and I know what I'm doing. That's not the thing. He asked what the thing was. I said the grief. My father died and I went through the worst period of my life and she was there and I let her in completely. And I believed that what she was giving me was given freely. And I don't know if it was. I will never know with certainty whether the person who held me together after my father died was genuinely present or was managing an investment. And that uncertainty, That's what I can't resolve. Robert nodded. He said, That's the thing about a deception that contains real emotion. You can't surgically remove one from the other. They've grown together. You're left with something that is genuinely both things at once, and you have to find a way to hold that without it destroying what was real. I thought about that for a long time. The thing about grief is that it doesn't follow the logic of the situation that produced it. I grieved Vanessa. Not the version of Vanessa I eventually understood, the one who had sat at a charity dinner calculating timelines, but the version I had lived with for 4 years, the woman in the gray sweater on Saturday mornings, the one who had liked that painting at the gallery, the one whose laugh I'd heard across so many tables and believed was entirely unmanaged. I grieved that woman because she had been real to me, even if her origins were not what I'd believed. I also grieved my father in a way I hadn't been able to while the marriage was containing the grief. There is something about betrayal, once it has been named and processed, that clears a space for the grief that was already there waiting. I visited his grave in January, a cold, clear day, and stood there for an hour and said the things I should have said while he could hear them, and came home and sat in my new apartment in the early dark and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in 3 years. He had suggested the prenuptial agreement. Gently, because that was how he suggested things. I had declined. I have thought about that conversation many times, whether, if I had accepted, it would have changed things. Whether Vanessa would still have married me with the prenuptial in place, with the inheritance protected, with the financial calculations significantly altered. I think she might not have. And I think that, in some version of the story, that would mean I was protected by the very document I'd rejected as a failure of faith. I don't know what to do with that. I've decided not to try to do anything with it, that some of the shapes left by experience are not problems to be solved but topographies to be understood and lived around. The consultancy is doing well. I took on 2 new partners in the spring, both good engineers, one of whom brings a business development instinct that complements what I do technically. The work has been the thing that most reliably tells me who I am. The way it always has been. I build things that hold. I test them against the forces they'll encounter, and I make adjustments, and I put them in the world and they stand. There is a satisfaction in this that money never fully explained and betrayal never fully touched. I am not dating. It is not a principled decision, not a vow of solitude or a statement about women or love or trust. It is simply that I am not yet at the place where I can offer someone what that requires, and I understand myself well enough to wait until I am. Robert says this is healthy. I think Robert is right. My father's money is invested now, properly, with Patrick's guidance, in a portfolio designed for the long term rather than the immediate. Some of it went toward a scholarship fund at the engineering school where I studied, something I'd been meaning to do for years. The fund is small so far. It will grow. It is the kind of thing my father would have liked, which is the criterion I used. What I have understood, working through the long tail of this, is something that sounds simple and is not, that the worst thing Vanessa did was not take my money or my time or my trust. It was that she introduced a permanent uncertainty into my memory of my own life, a doubt that applies not just to her but to my own perception, my own judgment, my own capacity to know what is real in the moments I am inside it. That doubt is something I work on daily. The work is unglamorous and unfinished, and does not resolve into a clean conclusion. I look at the city from my east-facing windows in the morning light and I think about what I know, and what I cannot know, and what I am going to build with what I have from here. The light comes in. The coffee is good. I go to work. And I build things that hold. The story of Richard and Vanessa is, at its structural core, a story about the weaponization of intimacy, the deliberate cultivation of genuine feeling as a vehicle for financial extraction. What makes it psychologically complex, and what separates it from a simple con narrative, is Vanessa's own admission that the calculation did not remain purely a calculation. The question of when, and whether, a relationship built on instrumental intent can become genuinely real is the story's most uncomfortable and most honest center. Let's begin with the mechanism of the deception, because it is unusually sophisticated. Vanessa did not simply pursue a wealthy man. She gathered specific intelligence, through Kara, through Morris's nephew, through her own research, about the exact structure of Richard's inheritance, the amount, the timeline, the 3-year condition. She identified not just a target but a window. She understood, with professional precision, that what she needed was a marriage of sufficient duration to survive scrutiny and establish legal standing, timed to coincide with the release of the estate funds. This level of planning places her deception in a different category from impulsive opportunism. It was premeditated. At what point do you think she crossed a line she couldn't come back from? When she attended that first fundraiser, or when she accepted the second invitation knowing who Richard was? Richard's failure, and he names it himself, is not a failure of intelligence but of application. He is a structural engineer who spends his professional life testing hidden load-bearing elements, and he did not apply that framework to the most important structure in his personal life. This is not stupidity. It is the specific vulnerability of a person in love, the way genuine feeling creates a perceptual filter that assigns benign explanations to anomalous data. Every sign was there. The premature interest in finances, the Maplewood listing 3 days after the transfer, Kara's professional profile, David's recollection from the charity dinner. Richard saw all of it. He just couldn't, for a long time, allow the pattern to become a conclusion. The father's death is the story's most emotionally loaded element. Richard's grief and Vanessa's proximity to it create the story's deepest wound, not the financial betrayal, but the uncertainty about the grief's containment. Was she present because she cared, or because she understood that being present during grief is the most efficient way to deepen emotional dependency? Vanessa says the grief support was real. Richard believes her. And then he says, with devastating precision, it doesn't change anything. That line is the story's emotional climax. The acknowledgement that genuine emotion and instrumental intent are not mutually exclusive, that something can be both real and part of a strategy, is the kind of moral complexity that most betrayal narratives avoid because it resists clean resolution. The protective measures Richard takes, separating the account, engaging Angela, commissioning Sandra's investigation, are the actions of someone who has learned to apply his professional skills to his personal crisis. The timing of the account separation, in particular, is the pivotal practical decision of the entire story. It demonstrates that he moved from suspicion to action before emotion overwhelmed judgment, which is rare and which saved him from a significantly worse outcome. Would you have been able to make that call, the same day, before the confrontation, while still living in the marriage as if nothing had changed? Step back from the specific details of Richard's story and what you find is a meditation on the difference between price and value, and on the way that human beings, when treated as financial instruments, retain a particular dignity in the process of discovering what was done to them and choosing how to respond. Vanessa's error, the deepest one, beneath the legal and ethical ones, was the assumption that a relationship could be simultaneously real and instrumental without the instrumental dimension eventually consuming everything it touched. She may have been right that her feelings changed. She may have genuinely loved the man she married, in some form, by the time the marriage was a living thing rather than a strategy. But she built the structure on a foundation she could never fully disclose, which meant the structure could never be fully inhabited. She was always, on some level, managing the distance between what she knew and what Richard believed. That management, sustained over years, produces its own kind of isolation, the loneliness of a person who cannot be fully known because full knowledge would be their undoing. What Richard does in the aftermath, the smaller apartment, the scholarship fund, the east-facing windows, the deliberate solitude, constitutes something more meaningful than recovery. It is a process of returning to the authentic shape of his own values, stripped of the overlay that 4 years of a strategic marriage had placed on them. He discovers, or rediscovers, that his identity was never the inheritance. It was the work, the building, the things that held. The permanent uncertainty he names, the doubt about his own perception, is the most honest thing the story offers. He does not pretend to have resolved it. He does not perform a triumphant reclamation of trust or self. He acknowledges that the damage to his capacity to know what is real, from the inside, in the moment, is real and ongoing. And he chooses to build anyway, with the tools he has, from the ground he's standing on. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing any of us can do when the structure we trusted turns out to have been built from a false datum. We recalibrate. We measure again. We begin from a truer reference point, knowing the measurement will never be perfectly certain, and we build what we can with the light that comes in.